Hello everyone, my name is Alanzo Julian Paul, and it's such an honor and a delight to be sharing with you from Canada, from Toronto. It's such an honor to be with all of you, and I'm so glad and so proud of y'all for rocking up and coming out to this HTB Youth Weekend away. Big shout out to my boy Tom Clark, who has put on so many things, and Yaz, who has put on so many things and worked with me. Man, I love you guys. And can you just give all of them, everyone that's given their effort and their 100% into making today happen, can you just give them a round of applause real quick for me? I'd really appreciate that. Now, if you don't know me, I'm Alanzo. I'm from Canada, born and raised, but I lived in Oxford for the past 3 years. I just moved here about 6 months ago or so, and I was studying at this little second-rate institute called Oxford University. I was studying something called theology, which was an amazing time, and that's when I first got to meet up with Tom Clark and I came and I spoke at your church last year at HTB with my boss, Michael Ramsden. And just to give you a little bit more of my background, I got saved at the age of 21. So the things that I'm thinking about are things that have really helped me during my walk. And what I want to do is just give you everything that I've been thinking about during this session, as well as the other sessions as well. And hopefully respond to some of your questions and all that kind of stuff during the Q&A time. My very last little introductory remark is, could you say a quick prayer for my boss, Ravi Zacharias? He just finished having a surgery, a major surgery, and he could just really use all of your prayers as he recovers with his family and everything like that. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much for doing that. Okay, so introduction to apologetics. Have you ever been to a dinner party, or maybe you just gone out for lunch? Maybe you're a godly person, so you went out to Nando's for some Nando's chicken, and the topic of religion has come up in conversation. And if you're anything like me, sometimes in those conversations, your heart and your confidence just sinks deep within your chest. I don't know if you've ever felt that way, where you have these moments where you're just low-key transforming into this mega prayer warrior, just begging and pleading for Jesus to come back at that very moment, because it would be much easier to go through Judgment Day. It would be a cakewalk compared to answering and responding to your friends' tough questions about, is God anti-gay? Or what about evil and suffering? Or is there evidence for God's existence? Or what the heck, what's going on with hell? What's all that about? I don't know if you've ever experienced that sort of thing. If you have, then you're not alone, fam. You're not alone in that. I've shared many a hot plates of chicken and peri fries with my friends that don't believe in God, and these sorts of questions have come up, and I've just felt my confidence melt away. So thinking about questions is actually really, really important for all of us to think about. In fact, various surveys inform us that one of the primary reasons for why Gen Z, young people like you, and adults, one of the primary reasons for them leaving their faith and hope in Jesus is because people have not taken their questions seriously, or they felt like they've never had a proper answer to their questions. And at almost every single RZIM event that we do at churches or youth groups, we have young people that come up to us afterwards saying, I didn't know that I was allowed to ask questions, or I thought I would get in trouble if I asked my questions. And maybe you felt that way before as well, and that's okay. You're not alone in that. But what I find absolutely fascinating when I read the Gospels, these biographies of who Jesus is, that Jesus is never intimidated by questions or scrutiny or close study. I don't know if you've ever noticed that before. In fact, every time that I read the Gospels, every time that you might read the Gospels, almost every single story about Jesus has people just bombarding him with questions. And far from just drop kicking them off of the face of the earth like we might expect he would do, he takes their questions extraordinarily serious and engages with them. Do y'all remember that story in John chapter 11 about Mary and Martha and their brother Lazarus that died? When Jesus arrived on the scene, he rocked up and both sisters came up to him, rushed him, and exclaimed, "Yo, fam." And I'm reading from this really contemporary translation of the New Testament. Really what they said was, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." In other words, where were you, Jesus? And notice, this is critical. Notice that Jesus doesn't scold them. He doesn't dodge their question. He doesn't shy away, but engages it head on. With Martha, he meets her where she is at and engages in an intense intellectual, theological discussion with her. But with Mary, he simply just falls into the dust and weeps alongside her. So here we combat the first huge misconception. Jesus is not intimidated by your questions. And very much in our 21st century culture, Jesus' first century Greco-Roman context possessed a multitude of meaningful questions. And this is why the Apostle Peter in 1 Peter 3:15 instructs all believers the following: always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you, to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. Now, this phrase, to give a response or to give a defense, is actually, it comes from this Greek term apologia, and which is the etymological or linguistic sort of origin for the word apologetics. Think of, like Marvel origin stories. It's the same thing going on here. And this is the biblical mandate for apologetics from scriptures to everyone that follows King Jesus, to be able to communicate the reason for the hope that we have, not to provide every single answer to every conceivable question, but rather to communicate why you believe Jesus is true. Now, this is a lifelong journey, apologetics, thinking and reading and discussing. So don't feel pressure that you have to know everything immediately. But Scripture is communicating to you and to me that people's questions, your questions, are taken seriously by God. And the reason why God takes your questions seriously and mine is because He takes our faith seriously. We're called, moreover, to engage with everyone who asks. Now, when it says to everyone who asks, what's the presupposition here? Well, this verse is presupposing that you're in a relationship and community with other people. That Christians don't shelter themselves and live in some weird subcultural bubble, but rather we're called to live in the very heart of culture. And it is based on our countercultural style of living that overflows with hope and love and service, that people organically begin to ask questions, whether from a position and posture of sincerity or from skepticism. And the goal of apologetics is not merely, it is so easy to win arguments but lose people. Rather, apologetics possesses this twin responsibility of making truth claims clear and giving answers to the questions that people have, while all the time remembering that there is an intrinsically valuable person behind the question, a person that Jesus died for on the cross. Now, this is critical to understand and remember that there is a person behind the question. And we must appreciate the complexity of people and the value that God has placed on the lost. Apologetics is a tool that we can use to persuade and compel, to remove obstacles and intellectual barriers and misconceptions, and bring much needed clarity in our culture of confusion. But ultimately, apologetics is not the thing that's going to transform people's lives. Jesus is the thing that's going to transform people's lives. The whole reason why we engage apologetically with people's questions is so that we can help them to cast their gaze with clarity upon the person and claims of Jesus and his cross. You can think of apologetics kind of like hot sauce from Nando's. You know, it's lit, it's helpful, it's tasty, it's all of these things. But you know what? It does not satisfy. The meat satisfies. The gospel satisfies and fulfills our deepest longings and desires. Now, I mentioned that there is a questioner behind the question. And this is fundamental to understanding apologetics and doing it well, as I found out the hard way. So check it. I was at this university events week. It's called also a university mission. It was at Leeds University. And I just finished rocking up and giving a talk on Jesus among all of the different religions and what makes him unique. And as I came down, this group of girls came, grabbed me, and said, "Yo, we have this atheist here, and we want you to talk to her." And I said, "Absolutely, I'd be delighted." And as I approached the table, I sat down with her, and she said, "Alanzo, I got one question for you." I said, "What was that?" She said, "Why would God allow children in Africa to suffer and starve to death?" And oh my goodness, man, I was caught off guard. I had no idea that this question was coming. And my confidence, it melted away. And I just responded with this reflex of giving her the textbook answer to this question. And you know what? It sucked. It was awful. By the end of it, she said to me, "Alanzo, is that all that there is?" And man, I remember walking away from that and just thinking about that over and over again. And I realized that I made a huge mistake. I missed that there was a real person behind that question. I missed that there was a real person with probably a sensitive conscience and a deep desire and longing for justice in our world. And most questions that we Christians face are going to be like this. It might be presented one way, like, why does God allow suffering? It might be presented, is God against homosexuality? But behind questions like that are people, more often than not, in real pain. There are tons of memories and moments behind someone working up the courage to ask a question. And what people are looking for is a meaningful response, rather than merely pondering the logical and philosophical nuances of their particular inquiry. And this is why the Apostle Peter, this is why he commands you and me to do apologetics with gentleness and respect. And when we transition from superficially arguing with people's ideas and ideologies to conversing with our fellow fallen human beings, humanization begins. And you got to hear me very closely here. My best friend, Daniel Gilman, he always reminds me, when we treat our fellow human beings not merely as adversaries, they do not become more human. We become more human. So apologetics is not only providing evidence and arguments and reasons for what we believe to people's questions, and it is that, but it goes deeper. It's thinking about, why would somebody be asking that particular question? What are they really asking? And how do I communicate what Jesus has done in order to persuade their mind and touch their heart in the process? Now, alongside the recognition that there is a questioner behind the question, is the following observation made by me and my colleagues around the globe. And it is this, that even though we live in this quote-unquote post-truth culture, which elevates and values emotions over the experts, even though we live in that sort of culture, there is an inescapable longing for objective truth in all of our lives. Regardless of whatever the cultural narratives and trends and currents are, people long to align their lives with the truth of reality. And don't let somebody throw you off either by saying things like, yo, there's no such thing as truth, or all truth is relative, or no one can know the truth. I don't know if you've ever heard someone say those sorts of things to you. I hear it all of the time. Not only will every mathematician and scientist and medical doctor that I know take an issue with that sort of philosophy and rationale, but all you have to do is ask questions, ask clarifying questions, and you'll see this sort of philosophical ideas just collapse on themselves. There's no such thing as truth. Well, is that a true statement? Or all truth is relative? Does that include that statement? Or no one can know the truth? Well, how do I know that you know the truth, that no one knows the truth? Now, even though people say these sorts of things, nobody actually lives. It is not the way that reality functions. All you have to do is rock up at the bank and you can tell that this thing is just unlivable. You may rock up to the bank teller and say, Mrs. Bank Teller, you know what, I know my truth is that I got £1,000 in the bank account. I know your truth is that, I only got 50p. But what she will say to you in response, invariably, is that, sorry, G, you're broke. You don't have £1,000. It just doesn't work like that in reality. And that's kind of like a lighthearted way of poking holes at this sort of thinking. But actually, it gets much more serious than that. Because at times in our culture will make these audacious claims that objective truth doesn't matter. Maybe you've heard that before. That our subjective emotions and feelings are supreme. Now, don't get me wrong. Our mental health is vitally important, but so is truth. But so is truth. It matters, and we all know deep within that it matters. I'm not sure how well acquainted you are with the 2017 hashtag #MeToo movement. But on October 15th, 2017, Alicia Milano posted on Twitter that if you've ever been sexually harassed or assaulted, write "Me Too" as a reply to this text. And according to Pew Research, over 19 million times has that hashtag been used since that first tweet. Just showing the magnitude of that problem. Now think about it like this. Imagine one of those abusers, or some intellectual in some ivory tower somewhere, try to argue that truth doesn't matter, that it's unknowable, that it's irrelevant or relative. In light of the hashtag #MeToo movement, how does that make you feel? What if we took this post-truth view of reality to its logical ends? How could we dare say that there is no such thing as truth to somebody that has suffered sexual assault or violence. Or that truth is relative, that perhaps the subjective, relative perspective of the abuser, that from their perspective they did nothing wrong. Or what if you boiled it down to, it's just your truth versus my truth? That sort of thing. But here's the fact of the matter, that we all know intuitively and deep within our own souls that it does not matter if that abuser thinks that their position is true. The objective truth of that situation is that that abuser was wrong. Objective truth is real and evident and relevant and matters supremely. The entire movement was birthed out of this sort of position, that objective truth absolutely matters to everyone and needs to be brought into the light. Think about just how precious the truth is to these brave women that had the courage to break the silence. The truth is the most precious thing in the world. And if that's correct, how precious and worth finding out is the truth about God. Because if God does exist, which I'm convinced he does, he is the source of all truth, meaning, life, purpose, joy, love, and can provide us with the truth about our real value and identity and destiny. Apologetics isn't some extinct intellectual exercise or discipline. It is a desperately needed discipline in our age, and one of the most relevant and meaningful things that you and I can ever engage in to help provide credible answers when we're sharing our faith and hope in Jesus, who claimed to be the truth incarnate. And if Jesus is the truth incarnate, then this opens up a whole new horizon of possibilities and answers to the questions that we have. I have one last story I'm going to finish with, very quick. It's about the Chinese cruel bread. Now, in mainland China, many, many decades ago, there was a famine on the inland. And this particular village was desperate to find food, but they were rather clever. What they did was, they harvested this particular type of clay. And you could take this clay and you could add water to it, knead it into a type of dough, and bake it over the fire. And as you baked it over the fire, it would produce this type of loaf, a loaf of bread. And this is what they were eating. But there was a serious problem that they found out several days later. The problem was this, that this bread, even though it could be eaten, was devoid of any sort of nutrients. No minerals, no vitamins, no protein, no carbohydrates. So even though their bellies were full, they starved to death. Do you know what the audacious claim of Jesus is? He claims to be the bread of life, that once consumed possesses all of the divine nutrients of heaven, of joy and meaning and of peace and forgiveness from God and love and a new identity and a new life, which is able to not only satisfy the mind, but the belly of the heart and all of our deepest longings and desires. And what if that's objectively true? Like, have you ever thought about that? Like, what if that's true? What if what's on offer in Jesus is actually legit? Then I think that there's an incredible incentive to check it out and investigate it for yourself, or bring some of your friends along to investigate it with you, because what's on offer is incredibly precious and meaningful and fulfilling. The more I study apologetics, the more I'm persuaded that we have the most precious message in the whole world. John 3:16. For God so loved, He loved you. You sitting here today, this morning at HTB Rock UK. He loved you and every one of your friends in every one of your circles. He loves them so much that He gave His one and only Son to die on the cross for them. What if that's true? What if you're really, really valued and cherished by God? That's incredibly powerful and incredibly worth exploring and investigating. And apologetics is a tool to help you investigate and help defend that claim. So in summation, as I wrap this thing up, what is apologetics? We give a reason for the hope that we have. Number 2, that Jesus is not intimidated by our questions. Number 3, that we acknowledge that there is a questioner behind the question. 4, we engage relevantly with the longing that every human heart has for objective truth. And lastly, we ultimately present clearly the claims of Jesus and the person of Jesus. The way, the truth, the life, and the friend of sinners. Thank you guys so much for giving me a hearing.